Good afternoon. This is the Board of County Commissioners Board Work Session. It is Monday, September 25th, 2023. It is 3:02 p.m. This session is set to go until 4 p.m. This is a hybrid meeting. We're at 3000 Pacific Avenue Southeast, room 110 for public virtual attendance. You may follow along on the Thurston County YouTube channel. I'm Carolina Mejia. I'm the chair of the board. To my right is Vice Chair Ty Menser. To my left is Commissioner Gary Edwards. Also in the boardroom, we have Assistant County Manager Robin Campbell and Assistant County Manager Rob Gelder. And we have guests from DNR here today, and we're going to be discussing the DNR Collaborative Management Meeting.
All right. So thank you, Chair and members of the board of County Council. I introduced myself to so many different bodies, I never remembered the format. Anyway, I'm Dwayne Emmons. For the record, I'm the Assistant Deputy Supervisor for State Uplands with the Department of Natural Resources. And yeah, we're here today to talk about county engagement, engaging with county councils throughout the state about management of DNR lands, to talk about the complexity of that management, to talk about how we can better engage with you as a county council, how we engage with our junior taxing district beneficiaries on that management of the trust lands that are held for the benefit of the counties and the junior taxing districts. And I know we've talked previously about the various trust lands that DNR manages in general. So I do have a presentation, I'll go through some of that quickly. I'll skip over slides so that we can, just have more of that conversation. I will attempt then to share the screen and to the bottom right. Thank you.
Can I do one thing?
Yes, please.
For a full size.
Yes, that's what I was hoping for too. All right, so just for, again, very brief overview. The department manages over 5.5 million acres of land across the state. We manage land in every county and every legislative district in the state. Some of those lands are managed by our aquatics program, the shorelines and navigable waters of the state. But that other roughly 3 million acres is what we call state lands. Those are lands that are held in trust for various beneficiaries across the state. Those lands either came through the state's Enabling Act and the state constitution, or lands that we hold for the county beneficiaries. Those came again as tax defaults traditionally in the 20s and 30s as timber companies, as railroads logged, then abandoned the land. Those went into tax foreclosure. Counties had 600 and more thousand acres across western Washington that they couldn't manage. And so those were turned over to the state to manage, to generate revenue for those beneficiaries. You always hear us talk about those trust responsibilities. Those come through the state constitution, through the Enabling Act, or lands that we hold for the county. Those are statutory trusts, but they are still true fiduciary trusts. The courts, the state Supreme Court, the US Supreme Court have all determined that these are true fiduciary trusts that we have obligations to. Recently, when we made our decision on our last sustainable harvest and an amendment to our habitat conservation plan to conserve more land for marbled mullet, that decision was made by our Board of Natural Resources in 2019. We were sued by both environmental groups and by beneficiaries when that decision was made. Within a month after that decision was made, we were sued by both sides. That challenge by environmental groups went to Superior Court. It was originally dismissed and then went up to the state Supreme Court. The court looked at that argument. The argument was, are these true trusts, the federal trust? Because the state constitution says these lands are held for all the people. And so the argument was, we have a duty to all the people, not just the beneficiaries that are named in the Enabling Act and the Constitution. The court ruled that those are true fiduciary trusts. They spent about 6 pages then outlining those trust responsibilities, and those are what are on the screen. Then they looked at, were those decisions that we made appropriate, and did they provide enough protection? There they said, we're not going to look at that. We're not going to look at whether those decisions violated SEPA or were arbitrary and capricious. They said where the court will step in is if we abuse that discretion. And one of those duties that we have is an abuse of discretion standard. If we go too far, if we give away too much, then the court will step in, looking at that fiduciary duty that we have. Those other lawsuits that were brought by beneficiaries were brought by both counties and by individual junior taxing districts, by fire districts, by hospital districts, by school districts, saying that we went too far, that we gave away too much. I'm very happy to report that just on Friday, that case was voluntarily withdrawn by the beneficiaries. They said, we're spending too much fighting over this. We need to move forward. We need to look at the next sustainable harvest. And so that case was voluntarily withdrawn. We stipulated to that voluntary withdrawal, but those issues are still there. Are we setting aside too much? Are we not doing a good enough job watching out for the beneficiary's interests? So again, that is what we weigh everything we do against, is that fiduciary duty that we have. I've talked about in the past our habitat conservation plan, our sustainable harvest level that we have to set by statute, the multiple use concept. In all of those statutes, the legislature as the trustee, they also reflect that duty to the beneficiaries. The Multiple Use Act says you shall endeavor to provide multiple uses, recreation, aesthetics, other benefits. Where those conflict with the trust duty, the trust must be compensated. So all of those talk about that duty, again, to the beneficiaries. I'll skip over the sustainable harvest, how we set that. I've noted before, all of our lands are certified under 2 different certification standards. Statewide over the state by the Sustainable Forestry Initiative, in our South Sound planning area, which is the majority of Thurston County falls under that. We're also certified under the FSC certification standard. These are some newer slides. Lands managed by DNR in Thurston County. Doesn't show up as well in the screen. There's the pinks and other kind of pastel colors. Those are the federal trusts. The very bright blue, those are called state forest purchase lands. Those were purchased by the department in the 40s and 50s. Lands that were about to go into default that we were able to acquire, put under our management. So those weren't lands that were ever owned or managed by the county. Those were directly purchased by the department. The lighter blue on Capitol Forest, it's up on the top, closer to the Summit Lake area, and then the larger blocks down by Tenino. Those are those lands that were county trust lands, as we refer to them. My eyes are not that good anymore. Roughly, I think it says 20,000 acres. Yeah, 20,000 acres is what we're talking about in Thurston County that are at that trust. This slide is from research from the University of Washington done in 2021 and part of a legislative proviso report that the UW did in coordination with our Forest Resilience Division, a separate part of the agency, looking at lands at risk of conversion. And these are small forest landowners who, through just economic pressure, through complexity with the forest practices rules and the Forest and Fish Act, what level of risk do they have at converting to non-forest uses over the next few years, so by 2030. So in Thurston County, roughly 5,000 acres is anticipated to convert to non-forestry use over the next 6 to 7 years by
When you say
2030.
non, what is non?
Non-forestry would be anything that's not forestry, so it can include converting to agriculture, residential, commercial. It's just anything that would convert it out of forest land and that forest land designation into another use. So those small landowners, that they may have 20, 40 acres, that is considered part ag and part forestry. The forestry part, it's estimated that that'll move out of forestry and convert to housing, convert to all ag or some other use.
Over what period of time?
I think the report said by 2030, so since 2007 statewide, over 100 and something thousand acres of those small forest landowner lands have converted. And this was to project going forward how much is estimated to. And it's I-5 corridor near Portland, near Seattle, right? COVID is accelerating it. People have learned they can work remotely and have, a 20-acre parcel out in the woods. And we're just seeing more of that conversion.
And who did you say did this?
The University of Washington.
You did.
This map, I believe, or this graph, I may have provided to you before. This is work that was done by an entity called EcoTrust. So there's an external conservation organization looking at the amount of timber harvest or volume that's being produced by different landowner segments, and then the amount of carbon that is currently stored on those different lands. So the top bar, and this is in Thurston County, this is for large landowners, large industrial landowners. That's a classification of large industrial timber landowners. In Thurston County, this is mostly going to be Weyerhaeuser. You can see the amount of volume that they produce on an annual basis. Gold is those small forest landowners, non-industrial private landowners. Don't know what the spikes. Some of that's just a reporting error or, how they were able to collect that data. Again, it's not our data, so we don't know. The state is in green, primarily DNR, but this would include other state ownership if there were counties that, generate revenue or, generate timber from,
What's the anomaly in 13 there on that?
This, I don't know. It's not our data, so I don't know if there was just a spike in, they didn't get anything reported in, the year prior or something, but it's definitely an anomaly, and I doubt there were small landowners that were harvesting that much in Thurston County in 1 year. So definitely I think an error in the data, but unfortunately, again, not our data, so I don't know. And then you can see the federal, not very much federal ownership in Thurston County. I think this is mostly Fort Lewis. They do harvest timber, not a tremendous amount, but they do harvest timber off of Fort Lewis. But again, less than even 10 million board feet a year, so maybe one timber sale a year.
Up by Alder Lake, I think we have some property that's in federal status.
Okay, yeah, and yeah, there may be.
It's a federal park.
Right. And so then this lower is the amount of standing carbon or carbon per acre that is being stored on those lands. So this isn't a reflection of how much is being sequestered every year. This is basically how much volume do they have that's just storing carbon. So the federal storing a lot, DNR is here in the middle, and then the industrial and those small landowners down below. So generally in every county, this same trend is there. Even when you're up in Whatcom County, when you're in Snohomish County, when you're in Clallam County, the Forest Service is not harvesting very much at all. They have a lot of volume standing, and so a lot of carbon stored, but not generating any volume. DNR is typically there in the middle. In Snohomish County, it's interesting, DNR generates more volume every year than even the industrial landowners, but then our carbon storage is still there, that mid-range. It's not surprising when we have dedicated setting aside half of our lands for conservation, that we have that amount in storage. Again, looking at all of the lands in Thurston County, all of the trusts, it's about 65,000 acres. In Thurston County, about 35% is currently in long-term conservation. As we've discussed before, Capitol Forest, the reason that was acquired by the department was because it was heavily logged. There was not very much old growth, old remnant forest left in Capitol Forest. It was logged, it was continually logged, lots of fires. And so that's why they were called the Black Hills, right? All of that logging, that early railroad logging at the turn of the century, and then fires continually happening. There isn't a lot of federal ownership next door to our lands. In other counties where we did all of our conservation for our habitat conservation plan, it's up against federal ownership where you get that greater bang for the buck, where there's already habitat in the national parks and the national forests. We put our conservation there. So there wasn't a lot here to start with in Thurston County, and so there isn't as much conserved as you see in other counties. Again, Whatcom County, it's almost 70% of the lands in Whatcom County are conserved, the DNR lands. Jefferson County, Clallam County, it's the same thing.
What is GEM? Can you go back?
Sure, yeah.
So if I look at that right, then if I look at, there's not much pre-1900 of the pre-1945, there's 5434, that's acres, I'm assuming. And then you've got the amount that's in the conservation groups, and then at the bottom it says remain, and if I do the math, it seems to be just the if it seems to be the other 5434 minus those other amounts, is that right?
Correct.
What
And
does
so,
GEM stand
yeah,
for?
GEM is General Ecological Management. So all of these others are either full conservation, or this category here, SOMU, is Spotted Owl Management Units. ROS is rain on snow, and then unstable slopes are geologic features that we can't do any operations on. The SOMUs and the rain on snow, we can do the full range of management. We can do variable retention harvest, we can do those thinnings, those variable density thinnings. After we do evaluation, is there enough habitat? Is there enough of the basin in mature forests so we don't have rain on snow issues? Those general ecological management is where, other than our evaluation for individual unstable slopes, cultural resources, riparian areas, what have you, there's generally not a management constraint.
So when we've, in the past, when we've written a letter and asked for, to protect, the pre-1945 unprotected, we're basically
Right.
looking at that 2110.
Exactly, those are the lands you're talking about, because everything else is already off base for us to go and operate on. And so this then breaks that down just on those Thurston County trust lands, that light blue that we talked about. So that's what these numbers are. You can see of all the pre-1945, pre-1900, we're talking about 600 or so acres that's just free from any of those other constraints.
These are the ones that the county transferred,
Correct.
even though they're called state forest.
Yeah. State forest transfer, yeah.
But it's, when you're talking about lands that, like, for example, are subject to reconveyance and all that.
Correct.
That's what this chart shows.
That's what these, exactly. Yeah, and those names have changed over the years.
Those names
It
really
was-
get me to
It was Forest Board, it was Forest Board Transfer, we call them county trust
Different
lands.
charts have the different
Exactly,
names, and
Exactly.
it's thrown me off a couple of times.
And so these numbers, these are the gross acres and the gross numbers. Whenever we do a timber sale, and we have talked about those timber sales with you in the past, each of those, they get habitat protections, they get riparian protections, they get leaf tree protections. Generally, every timber sale that we look at, even if we're evaluating a sale and it's 500 acres, we generally leave about 30 to 50% behind. Because when we're talking the gross acres, it's from the edge of the stream to the edge of the road to the edge of the ownership. But then we're buffering the stream, we're adding our leaf tree areas. We have unstable slopes within the timber sale. We have cultural resources that we have to protect. It's almost, every timber sale gets 30 to 50% is left. So the gross acres was 200 acres, this field evaluated, and we bring to the board for approval 100 of that 200 acres. So we're evaluating on every, one of those. So this 6,600 acres, we're not gonna harvest 6,600 acres. We're gonna harvest about half of that because of the protections we still have to go out and identify in the field.
This is a subset of the previous slide,
Yes, so this is just then those
and I feel like
county trust acres.
either to be in, I can't remember where the number came from, but at some point I had in my head that our county lands were 13% of capital state forest, but you're showing 20,000 out of 65,000, which is much higher percentage.
This is for all the lands in the county, so it does include those lands down in near Tenino and then other smaller
Are those,
pockets
and those are
around.
those county lands?
Yeah,
Oh.
if you go back to that,
So maybe if we're talking about capital state
Capital
forest,
forest,
it would be
a little different.
13% where I got
exactly,
that.
exactly. So now this, and I'll go through these very quickly, are just some maps showing where that conservation exists around Thurston County. So these are those pre-1900 and pre-1945 stands out there around the county. This jumps over into Pierce County. Here are all the protections for natural areas, natural resource conservation areas, these larger blocks. Then it also is non-forested, so roads show up also as, they're non-forested. Here then are long-term deferrals for either our habitat conservation plan, for areas that we've identified as unstable slopes, other protections that are for the life of our habitat conservation plan. Our riparian areas are also protected, and again, as I've noted, our riparian buffers are greater than those under the forest practices rules. They're greater than any other landowner in the state because of our habitat conservation plan. Then we have those areas of pre or post 2000. These are areas that have been logged since 2000. So greatest, they're 23 years old. These are areas that we can operate on, but we're not gonna get revenue for quite a while. And now we have those spotted owl management units and those unstable slopes, et cetera. And so areas of short-term deferral where we maybe don't have legal access, we don't have an easement. So this is the big one. This is the lands that we have to operate on, those gem lands. This is that green. This is across all ownership, across all trusts. This is where we're operating in Thurston County. That's that remainder.
What's that purple stuff? There's a whole bunch of acronyms.
Yeah, that purple is Natural Area Preserves, NAPs, or Natural Resource Conservation Areas. So those are rare plant communities, Mima Mounds, Kennedy Creek Natural Area. Those are natural area preserves. They're not areas that we're managing for timber. In fact, they're not trust lands anymore. They were transferred out of trust status into a protected status. So Thurston County is fortunate in that, again, there weren't a lot of, there weren't murrelet habitat, there wasn't spotted owl habitat. Where we did all of that conservation was in other counties, in Wahkiakum County, in Skamania County, in Clallam and Jefferson County. Those counties, some of them saw, again, almost 80% of their lands set aside for conservation. Thurston County, especially Capitol Forest, is really that working forest and is very good growing ground, very close to mills. Don't have a lot of habitat constraints. And so the county and the beneficiaries are benefiting from that conservation that was done in other areas. I like to note that carbon doesn't stop at a county boundary. Economic activity doesn't stop at a county boundary. A lot of these are regional issues. These aren't, specific to one county or to one property. These are all kind of codependent. I know we've talked in the past about how the revenue for these county lands gets distributed to the junior taxing district beneficiaries, so I won't go into that. And again, we've talked before about the breakdown, how a timber sale that's valued at 2 million, our management rate, we're funded through management. We don't get our funding from the legislature. So the beneficiaries on a $2 million sale would receive 1.5 million. It's distributed by the treasurer to the junior taxing district. Typically, it's the school district that is the largest beneficiary of those funds. And each of those junior taxing beneficiaries are beneficiaries of that activity.
And so, I know this is a general question, but it just seems, you put a point on it by saying that we're lucky in the sense that we get that revenue and other counties would not. And because these beneficiaries are often localized, as you just described, I know sometimes they go to a common trust and they get distributed, but
Right.
there are instances in which it's super localized.
Right.
And it just seems to be a non-logical way to fund or generate revenue for local beneficiaries. It's not another county's fault that they have habitat for an animal, and it's a statewide value to protect endangered species and
Right.
biodiversity. So maybe just
So-
jumping to
so
a
the
higher
question is
level
the-
of policy,
is the
how do we
why?
unravel
Right.
this?
Yeah.
Because that's not sustainable.
Right. Because these are statutory trusts, they were created by the legislature. They were created in that manner where it's that, it's very place-based because it followed the normal, what does a county do whenever you have a tax foreclosed property, right? And you have them even today, right? You get those tax foreclosed properties that the county holds and then disposes of. And then I believe it's still today that the revenue from that gets distributed into that tax code area. Back when these were created, that's what the legislature said was, in Thurston County would have disposed of that land if they could, if there wasn't such a glut of that on the market, and if anyone wanted cut over timberland, they would have disposed of it, and it would have then been those revenues would have been distributed. And so the legislature said DNR will hold it, will manage it, will make them productive, and will continually generate revenue for that set of beneficiaries. It has been discussed even at the state Supreme Court level that these are and can or could be managed as a unitary trust, where all of the county trust lands could just be managed across the board for all of the counties and all of the beneficiaries as a single trust. The law, the statute says when we generate revenue, it has to be distributed very place-based. So for the
It's a
department.
statutory law that the legislature could change.
Yes. Yep, because these are statutory trusts, the legislature could change how they're held. It's been discussed to manage these as a unitary trust, as you can imagine. And I know you have participated in county, Association of County meetings. There is broad disagreement on whether unitary trusts are a better idea than individual county trusts. So you're right, that is something that the department, we manage the lands, we manage them for the trust beneficiaries, but some of those discussions, those are legislative discussions. Now, and again, we're here talking about that engagement. As we're operating under the rules that we've been given, another I'll note, those lands that we hold in trust for the counties, statute requires us to make them productive primarily for timber production. We don't have the ability to diversify the portfolio like we do with the federally granted lands. We have commercial real estate, we have agriculture, we have clean energy, we have mining and mineral leases, we have communication site leases. On the county forest lands, we can do communication site leases, we can do mining and mineral leases, gravel pits, because those are traditional forestry uses of those types of properties. But we can't divest in timber and acquire commercial real estate. In fact, we can't sell these lands. Only in the last legislative session were we able to change the statute to allow us to directly transfer them to other governmental entities if land is better suited for a park or for a habitat area. We can transfer it directly to Fish and Wildlife, to our natural areas program, to state parks, or to the county for recreation use, for habitat conservation use. In the past, we had to do a very complex shell game. We had to take a piece of, if Mima Mounds were county trust lands, we would have had to find some federal trust nearby, value the properties, get an appraisal on each, swap the designation. So now this one is county trust land and this one is now common school. Then we could transfer the common school to our natural areas program. We couldn't just directly transfer that county trust land until this last legislative session. We were able to change that as part of the encumbered lands and trust land transfer work that we did with the counties and with the other beneficiaries. So we have to hold these lands. We have to hold them where we are, and it's very hard to move them into any other ownership. So now, and again, the reason we're here, the reason I've been talking with a number of counties around Western Washington and soon around the state is because we deal with this every day. We know that you don't. And when we do things like set our sustainable harvest level, that was originally supposed to be set, it's a decadal harvest level. And the last decadal sustainable harvest was supposed to end in 2014. But because we were amending our habitat conservation plan at the same time, we didn't set that. It should have been set in 2015. Didn't get set till 2019. We're now ending that sustainable harvest decade, and we're about to start doing that work in the next sustainable harvest level. And so those discussions about where to set aside, how to treat old forests, how much habitat should we set aside for the marbled murrelet, those discussions with the federal services, with scientists from Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries Service, discussions with beneficiaries, discussions with stakeholders, that all happened in 2014, 2012, all the way through 2019. And then, as I said, we got sued. But it didn't happen with you as the current, county commissioners. And so we need to make sure we're doing that engagement, not just once a decade, but continually. Because we know when you get letters from stakeholders, you don't know all the ins and outs of a particular timber sale. Our staff, I don't know the ins and outs of particular timber sales. There are too many timber sales in too many counties for me to know. So we want to make sure that our staff are communicating with you more regularly. There are counties, Clallam County, Jefferson County, they have a quarterly work meeting with the region staff, and they talk about individual sales. They talk about the work plan for the year, what things are coming up in 2 or 3 years. So those are things that we want to try and establish with all the counties, county commissioners, county executives, county councils, whatever the format of that county is. Some have the capacity, some don't, but we want to make sure that we're attempting to do that. We also know every county is different, right? You all have different areas of concern, areas of interest. I know Thurston County has a climate action plan, and I know I have staff that in their individual capacity as citizens participate on it. But that's different than the concerns Waukegan County has. Their dire concern is 30% of their operating budget comes from timber sales. And so their concerns are different. So we want to make sure we're understanding the concerns each county has.
I just want to do a time check, just because it is 3:33 and
Yep.
I want to make sure that there's enough time for us to actually have a conversation towards.
Yep. Yep, I will go through very quickly. So this is where we feel our baseline is through all of that work that we do. Where's our dial on revenue to support local services? Where's our dial on carbon sequestration and storage, contribution to rural economies, multiple use, habitat
Sorry, I don't really
conservation?
understand the colors.
Um,
What is it showing me?
So red would be, we're not doing very much, if any. Dark green would be, we are doing as much as possible for those different efforts. And so through our sustainable harvest and our policy for sustainable forests, our habitat conservation plan, this is where we feel we are in generating revenue. Part of the argument from beneficiaries that were suing us is we should be here, we should be maximizing revenue. That was what the conservation community said. You only maximize revenue, you need to do more for habitat. We said, no, we don't maximize, we balance. And so, again, this is where we think the dials are. As we're working in these conversations with you, we want to know where you think or want the dials. We also know that as you move the dials, there are trade-offs. If you conserve more, you're generating less revenue for beneficiaries. If you expand multiple use, you may have an impact on revenue, or you may have an impact on habitat, because murrelet conservation doesn't want recreation nearby. Recreation increases the abundance of crows. Crows are predators to marble murrelet. So we have large areas where we've designated no recreation. That's murrelet habitat. So all of these things have balances and have trade-offs. Now we want to talk about the tools. These are the things that we have now that we can work to achieve objectives. So I know you all are aware of the $70 million in funding that we received from the legislature to set aside lands up to 2,000 acres of carbon-dense, structurally complex forest. We're working now to identify that across the counties that have expressed interest. And I know the county council has sent a letter saying, we're interested in that. And is that, what do we need to do? So we're evaluating that across those counties, looking at Thurston County. We're hopefully going to be done with that work soon. We do have to present that to our Board of Natural Resources by December. Before we set any lands aside officially, we have to have that concurrence from the legislative body of that county. And so we'll be discussing that with you when we have that finalized and say, here's lands that we've identified. Do you agree, that you want lands conserved in your county?
Can I ask a couple
Yes.
questions on that? So you kind of, one part where you were losing me was when you had the map and all the dots that were coming in, and this is, so, are there lands, are there lands that are disqualified from your consideration because of those dots or some other obligation? Because when we look at it, I don't frankly even care what state and what county, because it's forest land that's important to my constituents in my county, in my district, and we're not seeking to take them back for reconveyance.
Right.
So to me, I don't really care about that. I know it's really important to you guys, but like I'm looking at a higher level, like
Right.
when I'm looking at this stuff, when I'm talking to people, can you tell me that certain things are off the table?
Right. In this, the funding here, it is blind to which trust it is. And so when we're looking to place those, we're blind to which trust. And the county, this is one of those unique areas where the county would have a voice on another trust's management. And that was a reflection of those counties that are very resource dependent and have a lot of, jobs that would be impacted by setting aside lands, regardless of trust. And so, the legislation provides that the county would have that voice in, if we set all 2,000 acres aside in Wahkiakum County, that would be devastating for their county, regardless of whose land it was. And so this allows them to have that voice to say, no, we're not interested in that. Where Thurston County can say, again, regardless of trust, that is something our community values, and so we.
So you guys are
have
coming
that.
up with a list and it's gonna be based on the criteria in the law, not just
Exactly.
it's not gonna be complicated up by which trust it's under.
Exactly. It'll be blind to trust.
That's great. And then can we give you input onto that, or that's you guys are taking?
You definitely can, and we will be evaluating that. It'll be, and we're receiving feedback from different counties. Obviously, you can imagine from individual stakeholders, individual timber sales that have already been sold. People, want to use this funding for everything. Again, we will evaluate, we will say, if that's a sale that has already been laid out, we've already made that investment. Juneau is a perfect example. That one's already been laid out. It's already got all of the permits, gone through all of the SEPA. It also is land that has a timber reservation on it to pay back a loan from the federal trusts. That's one we wouldn't consider.
So that
Because
is,
it has those multiple constraints on it. We've got 1 point something million acres of land, and I'm setting aside 2,000. I can make sure it doesn't constrain our management in ways.
that's what I was asking.
Yeah, so there are individual ones that the department will make those individual decisions.
So the list will be blind as to trust, but then when you actually select, you won't be blind as to trust. You'll say, this one's got this timber reservation, you called it,
Exactly.
and that's, I call it trust repayment.
Right.
And that means, well, I'm not gonna select that. I mean,
Right.
DNR would say that.
Exactly. We do have that duty of undivided loyalty to the beneficiary, so we have to make sure we're not harming the beneficiaries as we're doing this.
And then the other thing, and I may be jumping ahead of you, but I know we're short on time. The timing, I don't know exactly what your timeline looks like. A lot of the areas that I believe will be on your priority list are scheduled for cut in the next year, 2 years. So can we not lose the important areas that we want to protect because of this timing conflict?
Right, yeah, and those are things that we also will be looking at. And I know the county provided a letter that had different areas identified. We will be evaluating those, whether they actually do meet the criteria. 1945 is just a number. It does not mean that they're carbon dense and structurally complex. It just means that they were harvested prior to 1945. And so we've been working with the conservation community on what is that intent and what does carbon dense structurally complex look like? And that is using existing tools and guides that we have to identify out in the field what is a complex forest. So again, we're also gonna try and get co-benefits. If it's adjacent to something that already has habitat benefit, that's what we wanna do. Putting 10 acres over here, surrounded by 20-year-old plantation, that doesn't help. It sequesters carbon in that spot, but you could get more benefit if you conserve something over here. And so we're looking at that as well. That's what the commissioner has asked us to do, is look at adjacency and getting that co-benefit. But yes, if the commissioners send us a list of sales or a list of priority areas, there are sales that were in that list from the letter that our staff haven't started working on yet, that were 2025 sales. things like that. And there may be areas that, again, weren't identified, but are actually better and more complex.
Right, sure.
Um,
When you, one more question.
Yes,
When
no, no
you had, can I ask this question? You know, we didn't come at our effort as a board to protect the older areas, we really didn't come at it like purely from a standpoint of climate change. I know other counties seem like they have. We saw the letter that King County recently sent, and I know there was that court case in Jefferson where there was something about a pausing of a sale because they said that DNR hadn't gone through a climate analysis, something like that.
Right.
How does that connect to, I guess, like when you've got your dial set at, you know, green on carbon storage,
Mhm.
but then the court's saying that you guys didn't actually do the right analysis? I mean, how do you square that for me?
Yeah, so in that case, that was a SEPA challenge to our SEPA process, where the court said, ultimately, you have a great record on climate and carbon because you analyzed it in your environmental impact statement for your sustainable harvest and your marble murrelet amendment to the Habitat Conservation Plan. And you have all this research that went into that. However, you didn't attach it to your checklist. Most organizations, including Kitsap County, including King County, DNR, including Snohomish County, when they answered the checklist question that says, will there be emissions? They all answer it the same way we did. There'll be some emissions from logging equipment. That's what ecology, when they're looking at emissions, they're looking at, if you're a refinery, are you emitting? Are your operations gonna emit? But nobody answered that question in the past. What's the life cycle of the wood products that come off the landscape? So the judge said, great record, you analyzed all that in your big EIS. And in our EIS, every alternative that the board had to choose from showed that we will sequester more carbon than will be lost through timber harvest. Again, because we've set 50% of our lands aside, they're still growing, they're sequestering carbon. What we did was we said, okay, we'll redo that. Now our SEPA checklist, we answer that by attaching by reference the research we'd already done. We resubmitted that timber sale. We received no SEPA comments, and that timber sale now has been resold. So that was a process foul. How do you answer that checklist? Is it just the emissions from the machinery, or is it the broader emissions? And so, again, we've done that analysis, and we've shown that our management sequesters more carbon than it emits.
Okay, thanks.
Some of the other tools that we talk about on here, I know you're familiar with reconveyance as a concept. Land pooling that's part of when we acquire new lands, and it almost goes to that unitary trust idea. It is very hard if we set aside county lands in Thurston County to acquire lands in the same junior taxing district. At best, if I set aside something in Capitol Forest, I may be able to find something in Yelm or Tenino, but it's a different junior taxing district. Statute was again changed last session to allow the county to either distribute that revenue now in that new tax district, or come up with a mechanism to transfer that revenue back to the original tax district. It's up to the assessor's office and the county council to figure that out. What's the mechanism you can do that? Skagit County had to work on that in Blanchard, when Blanchard Mountain, we did an exchange of lands up there. They were able to do it. It's not easy. Land pooling is another concept in that. If we're setting aside 2,000 acres across Western Washington, if I'm able to acquire 2,000 acres in Jefferson County, all of the counties who want to participate in a land pool, they could share in the ownership of that. And that revenue can be distributed back to each of those counties based on the amount of land that was set aside in those counties. That was originally a tool developed for those what are called encumbered lands counties, those counties that had an inordinate amount of lands set aside for conservation. The legislature is attempting to fund replacement of lands for Wahkiakum, Skamania, Pacific, Clallam, and Jefferson County. Again, just that is in excess of $300 million is what we and the beneficiaries have estimated we need to replace those lands. We hear talk about setting aside the 77,000 acres of pre-1945 lands. Just put it into conservation, it would be better, for carbon sequestration, for climate. That would be roughly 750 million to $1 billion. I don't know that the legislature is going to find that even with the new Climate Commitment Act funding. And again, everything goes back to keeping those trust beneficiaries whole now and in perpetuity. We look out 100 years. It's not a short term. We have that undivided loyalty and that intergenerational equity that we have to look at. Trust line transfer is another, I know you may be familiar with. It's just another mechanism for the legislature to buy out the interests of the trust. Mima Mounds, again, would be the good example. Much better as a natural area than trying to do an agriculture lease or something on it, plow down all the mounds and plant crops. So the legislature bought out the interest and we then bought replacement land somewhere else. Some of these others are just other funding that we received through the legislature. One of the things that we will be doing, they did provide $2.5 million for the department to convene a group of stakeholders and contract with experts to look at carbon sequestration, managing some of those older stands that are on base for harvest, changing rotation lengths, and you get more volume and more carbon being sequestered. But what is the impact to wood supply? What is the impact to jobs? And again, none of these are individual county issues. These are regional issues. So we have participation from county commissioners. We have participation from environmental community, from industry, and from outside experts that we'll be contracting with over the next 2 years to talk about these issues as well.
Okay, I'll open it up to
We should do this last slide.
this last slide.
Last slide
right?
is
Like
we
it's
will
an important
continue
one.
to be here because I can never finish this in an hour. It takes multiple hours.
5 minutes left.
I apologize.
You want to finish this slide?
This really just is, we're going to continue to engage.
Okay. Questions, comments?
I guess my only comment would be, I think you're working for China and Russia, Pakistan and India. They're putting a new coal-fired plant on every day. So you're gonna sequester that carbon, I guess. Sadly.
Commissioner Menzer?
5 minutes worth. So this kind of goes into the conversation we had out in the field, and I didn't quite completely understand the trust repayment, I'm calling it.
Mhm.
You said, if I remember right, that you showed the map and it was just slithers all over the place. So it was, without an overlay, I couldn't really make sense of how does that connect to areas that I would want to, I kind of need that really high level or that detailed overlay. But
Right.
But
Yeah.
my question is just kind of like if I remember right, you described that as being something that gets, it's like, there's a percentage interest and then it's an ongoing thing. It's not just like you tally it up and it's, okay, we repaid the debt, we're done. It gets reviewed in 2030, and then maybe we'd have to buy out the interest back. I couldn't quite, and how does this all end? Because
Right.
only a certain amount of money was borrowed, so why would this go on forever? It sounded really confusing the way we left things at the last meeting.
Right, so in the more vivid blue on the map, those are those state forest purchase lands. So those are lands that were purchased by the department. Those aren't what we refer to as the county trust lands. The county does benefit in the junior taxing districts. Normally on those lands, the department retains 50% of the revenue. 25% goes to the state and 25% goes to the county and the junior taxing districts. Again, those are lands that we purchased. Those subsidize the other work that we do on county trust lands across the state, because we're retaining that 50% instead of our normal 25%. But those are the lands that we purchased. On those lands, a subset of them are being used to repay a debt to the federally granted trust. We have two accounts when we retain that management right. One for the federal trust and one for the county trusts. And because those lands that we acquired from the counties in the 20s and 30s had all been cut over, didn't have timber, didn't have money to sustain themselves, back in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of inappropriate commingling of that management. And so the legislature did an audit and said, you used funds that belong to the federal trust and you need to pay them back. And so what they did was they identified timber that would be held to pay back that loan. So I'm not sure of all of the mechanism. I think they made the beneficiaries whole by paying them back, but then said you have the debt to those funds, to those management funds, that you have to pay back. And so as you harvest timber, you're paying back that loan. So now the county still receives 25% because they didn't want to harm the county. But the state and the department, they don't get that cut. It goes to the federal trust
I
management.
remembered all that, but the question is, when is it over?
It's supposed to be either completed by 2030, we have to do an audit of it. And if we haven't harvested all that land, they have to do an accounting and say how much is still left to pay back. And so that'll happen in 2030. In fact, our budget manager is scoping how much that'll cost to do that audit and make a legislative ask. But those lands that are identified as those repayment lands, those are set aside for that purpose, to pay back those debts. So that's why Juneau, the majority of that is that repayment. If we don't harvest that timber and pay back that loan, then the department has to pay out of the management funds that loan. And so those are the only funds we have. We would just be taking funds that we use to do our silviculture, our replanting, our maintenance of our roads, all of that, capital that we use to manage the trust, we'd be taking that to pay back the loan instead.
I just don't understand why it's so complicated. I mean, a certain amount of money was transferred. Every time you do, I know it's a really complicated analysis, but you got to account for it all. Why don't you just add it all up, and when the 50 million's paid or the 100 million's paid or whatever it was, we're done? Like, why does it have to have this like vague time and then this audit, and then there was something, it was even more complicated when you guys were telling me before that there'd have to be a repurchase, there's a percentage interest and a repurchase of that. It couldn't just be like, okay, paid, we're done. But it sounded like it was even gonna be more involved than that.
Yeah, it
And that's
slightly is, and it's just because of that, that removal. The revenue is in the timber. And so as the timber has to be removed, it has to be an audit of, have you harvested that much timber? And how much was set aside for, other purposes, et cetera. It's complex.
Thank you.
And I know we're at time. And as I said last time, either having individual conversations, I'm happy to do that, staff are happy to do that, because I know these are complex issues. And I can never stop talking about this stuff. I always go at or over time.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for coming here today and for, you know, trying to be collaborative or trying to start that collaborative relationship. You're right. I think we as a board really stand by our position still, right? In terms of, it hasn't changed that we want to preserve legacy forest and, you know, we really, in my belief, I feel like we need to find a resolution before any more sell or cuts of legacy forests continue. And, you know, I think we just need to reach that agreement, and until we don't reach that agreement, right, I feel like we're still gonna be in this, not contentious, but there's gonna be you know, just, you're gonna keep receiving letters from us and, just with our concerns, with our community's concerns. And so we're really, you know, for me, that would be the next step. How do we reach an agreement, or maybe just until, you know, we find a resolution to kind of, you know, stop the selling and cutting of legacy forest here in Thurston County.
Right, and that's where, you know, it needs to be those ongoing discussions. We can't cover all of this in one meeting. I think this is the third, including one out in Capitol Forest. I know we covered some of the same ground with what are the trusts, et cetera. So I think having individual discussions about, you know, upcoming work plans and timber sales that are, you know, coming up, and, you know, future plans, how we're able to utilize the tools that we have, what lands can we identify with that funding to set aside 2,000 acres, et cetera. We do have that duty to all of the beneficiaries. So it's the county, but it is also Rochester School District. It is also West Thurston Fire. And we've heard from some of those juniors saying that's real revenue to us. So it's having those conversations with all the beneficiaries. It's also having those conversations about our next sustainable harvest. We're just, now that that lawsuit is behind us, you know, from the beneficiaries, we're gonna start working toward doing the next sustainable harvest for Western Washington. And so that's gonna set the course for the next decade. And that's where our board, we do presentations every month to our board about this. And so it's engaging in those discussions as well. I know your board meetings are the same time as our board meetings, the first Tuesday of every month, so there's always that conflict. But that's why having more of these work sessions, I think, is gonna help.
Okay, so you will receive some input from us on those as you consider, you know, where those 2,000 acres are gonna be placed. I know that we have a list of, you have a list of priorities, I believe you said. So we're gonna, as a board, kind of review those and send them your way. When do you need those by?
We'll be presenting to our board, we're hoping to finalize within, you know, the month of October. So it doesn't, you know, it's not immediate, but definitely sooner is always better. And again, we're doing that analysis too, and there may be areas that we highlight that, you know, you haven't received feedback on. We know that big trees, charismatic megaflora, people like big trees. Sometimes that big tree doesn't mean that that forest and that stand is gonna be there in 100 years because of forest health issues, you know, other things, so.
Okay, thank you. Okay, it is 4:06. We do have another meeting. You're adjourned.
I gotta run to the restroom.
Okay.
Thank you.